Good evening. So several months ago, I did a lesson on the history of the Bible. And many of you came to me saying that you enjoyed the lesson, that you enjoyed the way I presented it. And that's a twofold compliment to me. And first of all, thank you very much. This is not my forte. Public speaking is not my thing, contrary to what all of you seem to believe. But it's a twofold compliment because second is history is a very difficult subject to teach and to keep people engaged in and interested in. So over the next several months, I asked Brian if I could do a series. Over the next several months, we're going to be studying the history of the ancient civilizations of the Bible. We're going to be studying it from the perspective of secular history, mainly because you already know what the Bible says about Babylon. I want to tell you what you might not know about Babylon. I want to teach you a little bit of some of the history outside of what you'll find there. So the ancient civilizations we're going to look at are Egypt, Assyria, Persia, Babylon, Greece, and Rome. Those are the ones you've at least heard of. You might not know a lot about them, but you've heard of them. Now, tonight we're going to start, though, with one that comes before all of these. And it's not an empire, it's a region, the Mesopotamians. Mesopotamia, excuse me, I'll find my clicker. Mesopotamia is a region in current-day Iraq. And a lot of the things we're going to be studying is in digs that have been taken, archaeological digs have been taken in So that's what we'll be studying tonight. But in addition to that, tonight we're going to look at some common fallacies and pitfalls of ancient history research and archaeological research. It's going to be very important as you're looking at from a time span of so far back that there's going to be fallacies that you're going to run across and there's going to be discrepancies. So we're going to look at that tonight. Now, up until, ancient history in and of itself, time is relative, okay? Time is, for us, it's a calendar. It's a 12-month cycle. Back in the day, they didn't have this calendar. What they went by is things like the reign of a monarch. You see it in Scripture that in the 5th year and the 3rd month of the reign of King Solomon, this happened. Or the 5th year and the 6th month of the reign of Pharaoh so-and-so, this happened. So time was told by the monarchs. So that's how they did long-distance time discovery. Now for annual events, they looked at the stars. They looked at the Sirius star. Every time the Sirius star would rise in Egypt, they knew that the Nile was about to flood. They knew that, okay, they would watch the stars and they know this is about the time of season. In certain parts of the ancient world, they didn't have seasons like we do in the U.S. Here we have winter, spring, summer, and fall. In West Texas, that's called Monday. But it's... around here, you can tell when a season is changing. When the leaves turn red, it's fall. Whenever the trees bud out, it's spring. You can tell that. In some of these ancient civilizations, they didn't have that to go by. So they went by the Nile flooding, or the Euphrates, or the Tigris rivers flooding. That's how they told time. Obviously, the moon was one of the cycles of the moon. It happens very consistently, so they tell time by that. But time is relative. It wasn't until the 46 BC that we actually got a calendar. Julius Caesar came up with the first 365-day calendar that we started to use. Problem is, Julius missed it by 11 minutes. He was 11 minutes short. So by the time, after a few years of this, and a few centuries, he was missing a couple of days in his calendar. So in 1582, they revamped the calendar, and that is the calendar we use today. So we've been on this same calendar for, 500 years, roughly? So we're on a recent calendar. Now, unfortunately, it's off too, by about 26 seconds. So we started on time tonight. You just didn't know it because it's, that's added up since 1582. Time is still a relative term. Now, another thing that I'm going to explain right now, most of you are aware of it. I'm more giving it to the younger people so they know what's going on. So in my school days, you had BC and AD, right? So BC is before Christ. AD is Anno Domini, which is the year of our Lord in Latin. The pivotal point for time to be told is the birth of Christ. All right, if you look at records today, that's not what they use anymore. They use BCE and CE. Now, this is before Common Era and Common Era. Now, the only reason I take time to explain that is because some of the pictures you will see will reference that terminology. Most everybody in here knows what BC and AD stand for, but BCE is kind of a new thing. So I wanted to explain that and tell you what, in the old days, what that was. So I don't know what they're teaching in school these days. Now, it's kind of silly. The reason they changed it is because scientists didn't want reference to Christ in their work. They wanted it removed. Now, to me, this is kind of silly because BCE and CE, that pivotal point that things change, what happened? Christ was born. Same event happened, they just call it something different. Which begs a question, without Christianity, what year would it be? Just as something to think about. You don't know where it is. So there's your teaching on time. Now, nearly all ancient civilizations were divided up into dynasties or periods, so you kind of have a reign of time that you're looking at. Excuse me. Let's see here. Sometimes you will run into events. It's very hard to tell what time somebody's talking about whenever you're looking at ancient hieroglyphs. Very rarely will you have something that you can date to a specific time. There's only been one instance where in ancient history they've been able to tell you exactly what day and time something happened. In an ancient hieroglyph in Egypt, there was a reference to a solar eclipse that happened at sunset on the head of the Nile. Now, that's a fairly unique event happening, to be that specific and that happening. Well, they have software today that will predict when a solar eclipse will happen and where it will be. Last year we had a major solar eclipse. Mom and Dad went to central U.S. to go see it. How did they know where to go would be the prime spot? Because we have technology that will tell us that. Well, they took that technology and put it on its head and looked back. And they were able to tell when the last time there was a full solar eclipse at sunset on the head of the Nile. And they were able to find a date. But that is very, very rare. So finding precise dating is very, very difficult. So I'm going through a lot of explanation, and as we go through this whole series, you'll understand why. Dates can be misleading. Now, when we are in the 21st century, we're looking back 4,000 years potentially, or maybe even 6,000 years. We can get things wrong. One of the things they dug out in Ur was a tablet, and they called it the king list. And the king list listed 8 kings that came before the flood. So, okay, those 8 kings reigned for 241,000 years. That's about 30,000 years apiece. Does anybody see anything wrong with that? Scientific community doesn't even believe that. They said, this just can't be right. I told this to Dad, and Dad came up with the explanation. He said, it sounded like somebody's high school work and they flunked. Somebody's high school assignment, they didn't know what their dates were. The ancient texts that we have, we cannot authenticate sometimes. We have no way of comparing it to other sources. As we get closer and closer to today, more authentic and corroborating evidences show up. But in these ancient civilizations, there aren't any. It's quite often. We're lucky if we get a broken stone tablet to tell us something. I mean, we don't have Facebook. We don't have Time Hop. For those of you on Facebook, y'all know what I'm about to talk about, but for those of you who are not, God bless you, don't get on. But if you are on Facebook, you get a reminder every morning that says, hey, click here and look at your memories on Facebook. And it'll tell you everything you did on that day throughout the past years. I've got 10 years of history on Facebook. I was looking at it before services just to see what mine said today. It said, I'm preparing for a lesson tonight, 8 years ago. Okay, I didn't know that, but I was like, it's what my history showed up. You realize how much information there is stored about us these days? 1,000 years from now, how much people are going to know about us? Provided it survives, and more than likely, a lot of it will. I mean, we'll know what Christina had for breakfast yesterday because she posted a picture of it. We'll know. But we don't have that luxury going back in time. So whenever you're looking at this, I want you to keep that in mind. Now, if that's not enough, I have one other example. We're going to do a little bit of 31st century archaeology. Okay? We're going to move 1,000 years into the future. All right? And we're going to take this little church, and over the time of 1,000 years, it's covered by the sands of West Texas. All that's left is the steeple. And those 2 little guys decide to start digging. And they're going to figure out what's here. They don't know what's here. There's no record from this time period of what's actually in this location. Now you're going to walk with me as we walk through here. They unearth, starting here. They come to the cornerstone. They see the monument there that says, Canyon Hills Church of Christ, built on love and faith, Evangelist Donald D. Lacey, 1969. Okay. Church of Christ, that is a religious center, okay, built on faith and love. I don't know who they were, but I'm sorry for them. Okay, Donald D. Lacey, evangelist. Okay, evangelist is the root form of a religious leader, so this must have been the religious leader of this. 1969, okay, the building was built in 1969. Okay, we got that. And they walk in the door. They look around and say, okay, I see rows and rows of wooden pews. Well, we can see a group worship center. It was made for many people at once. Obviously, it was kind of a medieval torture device to sit in them for long periods of time, but that must have been, there's some penance type of thing. Okay, what else do we have here? Okay, they're all facing up here, so it's a dais. So this is where everything focused, and what do we have here? We have an altar where they had sacrifices. Okay. Oh, this is amazing. Okay. It was food sacrifices that they had, and okay, what else do we have here? Must have been a candelabra. They did incense or something like that. What else do we have here? Okay. Well, there's ancient coins in here. This must be the temple tax. But that's where they had that. And let's see, what else do we have here? Let's see. Well, I'm sure it's symbolized. It's very important because it's at the very front. So this must symbolize something. I mean, fertility perhaps. It was a fertility god because this was an agricultural center. Very well preserved. Okay, let's see. The podium. So this is where the speaker would address the assembly, and a pit. They have a pit. Well, a pit could be used for ceremonial washing, or maybe that's where they sacrificed the animals and the blood would run down. It wouldn't get on the carpet. Let's see. What else do we have here? Okay, it's seems to be another speaking arrangement for maybe a lesser religious leader. Let's see. What do we got here? I've only heard about this. It's amazing. What do they call this? This is chicken tape, I think. Duct tape. Got it. Okay, duct tape. That's what this is. Everlasting duct tape. It has a name inscribed on it. Okay, it's written on it. It says, Hey Don. Hey Don. Donald Lacey. Hey Don Lacey. Okay, so that must be his title. Hey Don Lacey. Hey Don Lacey, the religious leader. And Don is written again on here. And so it's very important Don used this. So it's Hey Don. Okay. And there's another name written on here. It seems to be a female name. If I remember the ancient text, that was kind of a female name. It's written in the same color as Hadon. And so Hadon and this person probably were at the same time, because of the fact that we have, since they're written at the same time, we're going to create the Dawn era. Okay, the Dawn era, we're going to say that he was a leader when in his 30s in 1969. The average age of a male in the U.S. at that time was 80 years old. So that would make the Dawn era from 1969 to 2025 approximately. And so the Dawn era. So if in the Dawn era this was written at the same time, so then Chelsea must be the same age as Dawn. Hey, Dawn. Do y'all see anything wrong with what I've said so far? It's ridiculous. Now, this is a farce, and I know that. But that's 1,000 years from now looking back. We're looking 4,000 years behind that. And there's a whole lot less information. We may be thinking that's a candelabra in ancient Ur. It has nothing to do with candles. So we don't know everything, and that's the point, okay? So as we go through these lessons, I am an amateur historian giving you information from experts that probably don't know what they're talking about. Fair enough? Okay. Now, if I do reference a time period, I want to do this. Time is difficult to determine. It depends on what timeline you follow. Some have a belief of the evolutionist theory where it's forever aged long. Then you have the church that believes God created the world in 7 physical days. Then you have those that created in 7 eras. You have people that say the world is 10,000 years old, and you have people that say the world is 6,000 years old. Okay, that's really hard to present a lesson when you have all those dates running around that they don't agree with. I chose one. Okay. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that these are absolutes. I want to make sure it's consistent. okay, in my lessons. These are consistent dates. This is something that I found. It's a tool, and I've got it over here on the wall if you want to look at it afterwards. This is the world history chart. It's a biblical based, but it's the start. Whoops, wrong button. Go back. It starts here with Adam and Eve, comes all the way around to present day. So it gives you historical events and peoples and times and places of things happening that you would recognize. And so, and it cross-references. So it might tell you, this is what was happening in China, this is what was happening in Iran, and this is what was happening in the Americas. So you can kind of follow the line, in 1582, this is what was happening in 1582 around the world. It's a really neat tool. I got one for myself for this study specifically because I wanted to make something useful to you. If you're a historian, if you're a history buff, I recommend you get one. They make them in smaller versions than what I've got, but I recommend you get one. It's a neat tool, if nothing else, just for reading purposes. It's really nifty. So now, I just did a Lyndon Latham introduction. Now on to the lesson. All right, in the city of Ur, the city of Ur was in the land of Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. So you've got what's called the Fertile Crescent here. This is Iraq, coming into Syria, coming down through Israel. Then you've got Sinai, then there's Egypt. Okay? But back in the day, this was where population was. If you want to turn in your Bibles real quick, we're going to do a couple of references in Genesis. Turn to Genesis 11. We're just going to read the first two verses. But it's the story of the Tower of Babel. But the first two verses is what I want to focus on here. It says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there." All right, so the plain of Shinar, that is Babylon or Babylonia. So whenever the ark rested, that's Mount Ararat up there. That's where the ark landed. When they left the ark, Noah and his children, they all went south. And they started spreading to the east. You see most of the cities of the ancient times, focused down here at the bottom. You get some closer to the water over here. There's not a great deal in the middle. You've got Nineveh, you've got Acer. But they settled in the south and they moved east. So you can kind of see how that transitioned in. Back at this time, before Babel, everybody was here. One of the reasons Babel existed, or Babel is a story in itself, is God scrambled the languages and made them split up. So everybody was building the cities. Everybody was building together here. So you get a mixture of Shem, Ham, and Japheth all at once right in this area. Now, back when Ur was being built, the Persian Gulf actually came all the way up to Ur. 4,000 years of silt from the Euphrates and the Tigris River have slowly pushed the coast away. And so back in its heyday, Ur was a port city. It was a merchant city. One of the things they dug up in Ur were receipts. That's one of the things that survived were many, many receipts of transactions. I'm lucky if I can get my boss to turn in his receipts every month. Receipts lasted forever. They were on stone tablets, and that's what they've dug up. But it was a merchant city. It was a trading port, a trading city. Now it's in the middle of a desert. Now, Ur can be divided up in periods. This whole region can be divided up in periods. The earliest periods are when the city was not a powerhouse. This is back when the developmental stage, when they were repopulating the world. There were the Uruk period and the Jemdet Nasar periods. That was the early eras when they were redeveloping. But all these cities started to develop about the same time. Now, after these early periods, Ur had developed into a major metropolis and a major city. There were three dynasties that they look at. It was the first, second, and third dynasties. There's a lot of information about the first, and there's a lot of information about the third. There's not a lot of information about the second. It's a dark period. We don't know why, but those who research can determine that there was a time between these two. But there's just not a lot of details about the people, the culture from that time period. Now, after this, Ur started to decline as invaders from the north and the east took over. So from the Zagros Mountains, they came down and they took over the city of Ur and the region. So you had the Isin and Larsa periods, followed by the Kassite periods. And then you had the Assyrians. The Assyrians took over and made Ur part of their empire. Then the Babylonians took over Assyria. And finally, the Greeks took over Babylon. And at that time, Alexander the Great came in and wiped out the city of Ur. So there wasn't anything left, and it was abandoned. That's about 530 BC. So Ur went from about 2300 BC to 530 BC. So it's a long-lived city. Very, very long-lived. Now, our biblical knowledge of Ur is limited to the story of Abram. He was from Ur, and he left the region in approximately 2000 BC, which would make him in the 3rd dynasty. Ur was considered a city-state, along with many, many others in the region. Most notable were Uruk, Eridu, Babylon, Al-Ubaid, Nineveh, Acer. These are all city-states. So back in this period, there were no empires. There was no nation. It was a city of its own, was its kingdom. And you see that if you look in Genesis 14. I want you to turn there with me. Genesis 14. The story goes, Lot, Abram's nephew, is captured by a group of kings allied against another group of kings, went to war, took Lot hostage, took him captive. Then Abram gets wind of it. He goes to war with the allied kings and takes them back. Now, if you look in chapter 14, I am not going to read all those names, but I want you to look at so-and-so, or so-and-so, king of such and such. So king of. There's a lot of kings in this little bitty region. So everybody had a king. Everybody had a kingdom. And these were allied kingdoms. But that's how governance was in this period. There was no nation to deal with. Now, I want you to read with me chapter 14, verse 17. We're going to read a little bit here because I find this important. It says, after Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. The king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and have taken an oath that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a thong of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. All right, so timeline, biblical reference, okay? Something just to consider. Whenever, according to the Bible, whenever Abram was born, Noah had only been dead 2 or 3 years. He hadn't been gone long. In the time of Abram, Shem is still alive. Shem is the blessed one of Noah's sons. Could it be Shem is Melchizedek? Now, I don't know that. There is no reference in the Bible to it. And the references outside of the Bible don't point it to anything either. But could it be that the blessed one of God, the high priest of God Most High, is the one son that followed God, what God would have done? Is it possible? I don't know. It's just something to consider. Salem is the future site of Jerusalem. So you're talking about God's city. You're talking about where God has centered everything for all of this time period. And for thousands of years to come, he's centered around Jerusalem. Something to consider. One thing I will point out, who Melchizedek is, beside the point, I want you to look at something that Abram did here. He defeats the king. He comes out, he's met by 2 kings. Who are the 2 kings? You have the king Melchizedek, and you have king of Sodom. What do we know about Sodom? They were not a good place. If anything, they were polar opposite of God Most High. So when Abram comes back from war, he's presented with 2 blessings. He's presented one from God or from what equates to the priest of Satan by reputation that we see in Bible. Because what does he do? He chooses. Abram chooses right here and now where he's going to put his faith. Something that I also picked out, and maybe it's just, and this may just be me, but what does Sodom offer him? He says, give me the people. Keep everything for yourself. Doesn't Satan tell us the same thing? Give me your soul, but you can have everything you want. It's been going on for a very long time. And Sodom was destroyed, but another 50 years later, they were destroyed. But I just found that as an interesting piece, in here. Take that as you will. Now, if we go back to the city of Ur, the great city of Ur was, first excavation started in the 19th century. But as many archaeological digs happen, it ran out of budget. And so they abandoned the project. So in the 1920s, a man by the name of Dr. Leonard Woolley began excavations once again with Penn State and the British Museum. And so he went to present-day Iraq, and he said, okay, where is Ur? And the locals said, well, it's out in the desert. Okay, he went out to the desert. They said, there it is. And all he sees is sand and a little hill and sand. That's all he sees. They said, that's it. He said, okay. So he starts to dig. This is what he unearths. This is the great temple of Nana, or Sin. It's the moon god. This was the temple worship of Ur. Now, interesting fact, whenever he was excavating this, the Iraqi government, once they figured out what was actually under there, they said, you can move all the sand you want. You can't touch a brick. So he just moved sand. I mean, they said, you can't even, if a brick is laying there loose, you can't pick it up and turn it over. They were that specific. They were that strict. You cannot touch the brick. You can move all the sand you want. And so they unearthed it. You can see up at the top where that kind of is true. There's just mounds of brick that are rubble. There's nothing, no structure to them, but he couldn't move them to find out what was underneath. They've never been inside the temple because they can't dig in. They cannot go into the temple. Now, as they were removing the sand, they found other things. Let me see here. Oh, this was an interesting picture I found. This is in 2010. So, Operation Iraqi Freedom. So these are some of our boys getting to do a little bit of archaeology too. I thought that was just neat to see that. This is what the temple is believed to have looked like in its day. So it's very much a large complex. It is called a ziggurat. Some of you have heard that term, but it's a ziggurat. It is made of baked clay bricks pitched with tar. If you look at Genesis 11, what is the Tower of Babel made of? Baked bricks pitched with tar. It's called bitumen, it's called asphalt, it's called several different things. But it's made the same way. It's believed that the Tower of Babel was one of these structures. In the site of Babylon, they believe they found the foundations of the Tower of Babel, and it's one of these structures only on a grander scale. It's a larger one. So it is believed that the Tower of Babel was something like this. It's all of the same period. Now this picture is a little bit misleading because the temple wasn't in the middle of a desert. It was in the middle of a city. Now as they removed all the sand, Woolley was able to find the city remnants. They found the ruins, the foundations of the city. And the rule applied only to the temple that they couldn't move anything. So they were able to dig in sites around the city. And so they dig here and dig here and dig here, and they finally hit a spot where they found some treasure. And of course that interests everybody. So they said, we're going to dig here. We're just going to dig a big hole and see what we can find. They dug a hole 70 feet wide, 60 feet deep, long, and 64 feet deep. That's a big hole. They called it the Great Pit. And they pulled it out level by level as they dug it out. Now the first thing they dug out was the royal cemetery. That's what they had found, was some royal jewels, just tombs that were devoted to the royalty. And they found a lot of treasures coming out of those. Once they got through the royal cemetery, they hit the city dump. It was a rubbish heap, nothing but rubbish. Below that, they found 8 levels of built and dilapidated houses. So they would build houses on top of one another 8 times. They dug a little deeper. They hit 18 feet of pottery shards. Now 18 feet, that's roughly the height of this building. 18 feet of nothing but pottery shards. Now, it was interesting in two ways. One, they were able to tell the styles changed as they dug deeper. So the style of pottery changed. So, you think today, styles are always changing. Well, even back then, styles changed from period to period. But they figured out that this was a pottery factory because they found the kiln and they found the pottery wheel, as well as implements for making pots. So they figured out they hit a factory, so they had industry. And quite a major industry to have 18 feet of broken pots. That's a major industry. They had that. Below that, they hit another graveyard. And below that, they hit a level of dirt. It was nothing but silt. Just plain dirt from a flood. And most excavators would have just stopped there because they kept digging, just nothing but dirt, nothing but dirt. But Woolley said, I know there's got to be something else there. So they kept digging. 18 feet of silt before they broke through. Now, Woolley declared at that time, I have found the great flood, and saying that he had found Noah's flood. Later, scientists said, no, that couldn't have been it. It was a localized flood. The Tigris and the Euphrates were prone to floods. This was a big one, but it was not the grand flood. Take what you want on it. It was still a giant flood that flooded this area. Below that, they found more houses. And they dug a little deeper. And they found what was a marsh bed that people had been throwing their refuse in for so long that it built up to a landmass that they could build huts on. And they finally dug a little deeper, and they hit fossilized reed roots. So Woolley said, okay, I've hit the bottom. That's all that there is. But that's how far he had to dig to get to the base. 64 feet of history, buried in the sand. It's amazing what they could dig out of that, and what a lot of these things we find digging out. Now, 4,000 years ago, this is, I do this, maybe you don't, I do this. I think 4,000 years ago, I think a bunch of shepherds, a few farmers. I don't really think about industry. I don't think about luxury. I don't think about, imports. I don't think about that. This is one of the first things they dug out of the tomb. It's a solid gold helmet, hammered metal, fine detail. If you look very closely, that's hairlines that they hammered into the metal. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that could do that today without a machine. It is intricate work, beautiful work that they have dug out of these tombs. And I'm just showing a few highlighted ones, not by any means everything. This also came out of one of the tombs. It's a lyre. Now, it is a wooden lyre. Wood had long decomposed. It was gone. But the outline impression in the dirt was still there that they were able to determine the dimensions. It was a solid gold head with precious stones wrapped around a wooden molding. And when they excavated it, they were able to keep it in wax, to keep it in its form before they were able to mold it back onto another wood frame, so you could actually see it today. The lining of it, this thing right here that you can see all the way around, those are gemstones and shells and other fine precious metals that they were still intact all the way around it, so you could see kind of the shape of the box. This all was preserved by time. Paparazzi, eat your heart out. This is a jewelry. This is the headdress of Queen Shubad, one of the last queens of the first dynasty, if I remember correctly. It was found in her tomb. She was still wearing it, along with an entire drapery of nothing but pearls and gemstones all over her chest. Just completely draped. They couldn't hardly find the body just because it was just so heavily ornated decoration. I mean, this is one other thing that I found. That blue stone, that's lapis lazuli. That's imported. They don't find that in Mesopotamia. That's from Afghanistan. So they knew how to import from a long distance. That's hundreds of miles away. They knew how to do their imports and exports, even at this early stage. Now, one thing else they discovered in this tomb is that human sacrifice was very common. Okay? What they found is when they were digging this particular pit, this is a different pit than the Great Pit. This was a secondary one that they found. But they were digging a pit, and they found the king's tomb. So the king died. They dug a pit. They buried him in a stone chamber. They buried the pit, or covered the pit. The queen died. They dug a bigger pit around it, and the grave diggers, while they were digging out the second pit, the archaeologists found out that they broke into the first one and robbed it because there was nothing of value left in that pit. And they took the queen's wardrobe and put it over the hole so that nobody would see it. Because that was all, it was the remnants of a wardrobe with all of her, the only reason they know it was closed is because the stitching was in gold. That's all that was left was just the stitching, but it was gold stitching that was left in the wardrobe. But they had covered the hole from the first grave robber. Second tomb was completely left intact. This is a recreation of what that tomb would have looked like as they were about to bury it. There's her tomb. A whole platoon of soldiers, 6 head of oxen, their attendants, carts, musicians, a whole gaggle of women finely dressed, in regal attire, just like the queen was, and all the servants along the back. They were found buried alive. Now, whether they were alive or asleep, I'm not certain. We're not sure. But they were not dead. They were recently deceased. Let's just put it that way. Whenever they were buried, the only thing that we have that might indicate that they were not completely with it whenever they were buried is because there were a whole host of cups all littering the floor of the pit. And they assumed that those cups had something like a sleeping draft or something to kill them instantly. The only reason we even knew that it was peaceful is because all those women right there, they're lined up against the tomb. They were all sitting down, propped up against the back of the tomb when they were buried. Human sacrifice was commonplace. And this is not just slaves. I mean, this is fine attire. This is the royal guard. These are important people. This is not just your run-of-the-mill slave. For a world that was where only a few centuries earlier there had been nothing but water, the departure from God is all but apparent. It is, you can't overstate it. Now, the Sumerians followed several deities. I've already mentioned Nana, which was the god of the moon and the underworld to some extent. The most powerful god, the god of gods, there was Enlil, which literally translated means Lord Ghost. Scientists don't know how to translate that to deity, so they call him the Lord of the Sky. There are 10 or 12 other deities in Sumer, and I won't go into all of those, but Enlil, it was known by the people of Sumer that Enlil had destroyed the world by flood, and that Atrahasis was spared because another one of the gods had warned him to take his family and the seed of all living things and put it on an ark, and they would be saved from destruction. And the story goes that Atrahasis was on the water for 7 days, and at the end of the 7 days, he released a dove, which was returned to him. He released a swallow, which came back, and he released a raven, which never came back. Does that story sound vaguely familiar? You will see the story of the flood show up in cultures all over the world. The story comes from the British Isles. You'll find that in their ancient histories. You'll find that in China. You'll find that in Africa. Nearly all ancient civilizations come back to a central root thought in their deity worship, in their religious thoughts. There was a great flood. Now, the details vary. The names change. Why do you think the names changed? Babel. All the languages changed. That means Jose became Joe and became Joseph or Yusuf. Those names changed. Based on what, yesterday that was Steve. Today, that's not Steve. We don't know what his name is because I can't pronounce it. That happened. So if you think about that, and then why did the story change? Well, some of them wanted to pervert it for their own business. Some of it depends on who told it. You ask, when my grandfathers were living, they tell you a story and it would change a little bit every time you told it, depending on what they remembered at the time. Some of those things change over time. Now, I am not here to contradict the Bible. I'm not here to contradict the story of Noah. But which one came first, Noah or Atrahasis? Technically, Atrahasis. It was written down in stone tablets before the time of Moses. Now, Moses wrote down the story based on what his lineage had told him. But Atrahasis was actually inscribed in stone before Moses did. So I'm not proposing we change anything in the Bible, just interesting things you uncover whenever you're digging through this stuff. All right. Where am I at? Now, coming back to Abram. Now, what do you think Abram believed? Abram comes from a culture now that is a multi-deity worship. It is commonplace in there to worship many gods. In some other text, it says that his father, Terah, worshipped the many gods. Whenever they moved, God called him, and they moved to Haran. Haran happens to be another place. Well, let me just put it. I think I'll put it up here. Yeah. So they moved from Ur. They moved up to Haran. Haran's about up here. And then they moved down and came into Jerusalem, and then they went to Egypt, and then they came back. So that's kind of his path. But what did he believe? Whenever he was walking through, God was talking to him, did he believe Yahweh was talking to him, the one God? Or was he think he was speaking to Enlil? When God talks to you, you really don't question who he is. You just do what he says, right? Doesn't matter what God you're serving. You just do it. And so what God was Abram following? The only reason I even bring it up is because of this. Whenever Abram goes to sacrifice his son, you and I know that's not possible. The God we know would never do that. Agreed? Yeah. Why would Abram do that? Because Enlil would expect it. Nana, it's nothing for Nana to do that. If he still believed he was following one of the ancient gods, this is not uncommon for him to do that. something they found in the queen's tomb was this piece. Does that look familiar to you? Does that look symbolic of anything you've heard of before? This is what Leonard Woolley named it, the ram in the thicket. Now, it's just symbolic to me, maybe it's just to me, maybe not to you, but this was buried in a pagan tomb before the time of Abram. So this predates Abram's story of the ram in the thicket. What I here to pose as a possibility is whenever Abram saw that sign, whenever he saw the ram in the thicket when he was going to sacrifice Isaac, did he know what it meant? Because he'd seen it before. Because that symbol meant something. Maybe that symbol in ancient Sumer meant a sign of redemption, a sign of forgiveness. Could have meant something that he understood. We don't get it today, what the ram in the thicket means, but it meant something to him. Just like that cross behind that piece there reminds something of us. It means something to us. Whenever I see this, this is what I see. I see a lamb hung on a tree. That's what I see. And I think Abraham probably realized right then who he was serving. He realized this is not like the gods I've been used to. This is not Enlil. This is not Nana. This is not any of those. This is Yahweh. This is a totally different God. This is somebody completely different. Now, as we look through the next several months, you're going to find God pop up in places you never expected him to. You'll find him in ancient digs in Ur. You'll find him in the throne room in Greece. You'll find him in the king's dreams in Babylon. You'll find him places that you don't realize he showed up in. The point is, God is everywhere. He's not just in the story of the Israelites. He's not just in the story of the Jews. He's not just in the story of the Christians. He's been everywhere. He's been involved in everything. And as we dig in, I'm excited to show you what I found. To show you that it's amazing to me how much he shows up all over the place. And maybe it's symbolism that maybe God didn't mean it that way, but it means it to me, which is important to me. I get it. I get it. And maybe that may just be me. And I'm sorry if y'all get my opinions, and that's a lot of it. But I'm hoping you'll enjoy it for the next couple of months. We'll be doing a lot. Next time, we'll be studying Egypt. And so that's a lot of information too. Hopefully it won't be this long, but we will see. Thank y'all very much for y'all's attention on that for tonight.